I am. All right. Well, good evening, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started on tonight's lesson. So this is the second lesson where we're talking about the general theory of evolution. It's lesson 2. And so I'll pray and then I'll recap what we talked about last time, and then we're going to jump in. And again, I got a lot of ground that I have to cover, and so the quicker I get into it, the better. So let's go to the Lord in prayer. God, we just thank you so much that you are God, and that you've given us your word, and that you've given us so much reason for us to know that you exist, the Bible's true, and all these worldviews that are raised in opposition against you are nothing but folly. I thank you, Lord, that we're able to assemble together and really go over these truths. And I pray, God, that in everything that the students will grasp all this information, learn it, remember it, and be able to use it to your glory. For we are called to destroy arguments and take captive any thought that's raised in opposition to you, Lord Jesus. And so may we do so. We pray all this to you, God, in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so last time we began to look at the theory of evolution. We went over its history. We went over a basic description of what the theory is. And I made sure to let you guys know that we don't use the words macroevolution as much anymore, or microevolution. Instead, we go with the words the general theory of evolution and the special theory of evolution. The general theory is the idea that all life is descended from a common ancestor, a single cell that emerged from a primordial ooze. The special theory of evolution is different. It's the idea of speciation, that you have certain phyla or categorizations of animals, and then you'll have new species form out of those. Now, the special theory of evolution has been held by creationists for a long time, because what accounts for the STE, the special theory of evolution, is a loss of information. The general theory of evolution would require the addition of new information, and that's impossible. It just doesn't happen. So I went over that last time. And then I showed how evolution can't survive a presuppositional challenge. What I mean by that is it assumes atheistic assumptions of randomness, but then it wants to assume the uniformity of nature. So you bring up the preconditions of intelligibility, and it doesn't work. Okay, so then for the rest of the time last week, we questioned one of their fundamental claims, spontaneous generation. See, the whole evolution story on Earth begins with this idea that there was non-life, and in this ooze, through natural processes, life came into existence on its own. That's called spontaneous generation. And so we were looking, first I showed you that information is what accounts for life, not randomness. And so information kills the idea of spontaneous generation. But in addition to that, we went over a lot of probabilities. What's the actual odds of this happening? If we are giving the evolutionists the most generous conditions possible, what are the odds of spontaneous generation? And it turned out it's impossible. It's absolutely impossible. These odds were staggering. And really, I think we dropped a nuclear bomb on the idea of spontaneous generation, but I'm going to drop a second one. Well, really, I'm just going to keep dropping them for a while. There's nothing wrong with overkill. And then when we're done with probability, we'll move on to uniformitarianism. So, jumping into the next probability issue, James Copperedge presents the problem a little differently. He writes this. He says, even if we take the simplest large protein molecule that could reproduce itself if immersed in a bath of nutrients, the odds against this developing by chance range from 1 to 10 to the 450th power to 1 in 10 to the 600th power. Two different scientists gave those alternate odds, but both of them are impossible. Whether we're talking 10 to the 450th or 10 to the 600th, it's crazy. Mechanical engineer Walt Brown helps you understand, put this in perspective. If you take the full diameter of the universe, it is only 10 to the 28th power in inches. And so 10 to the 28th power in inches is how far the universe stretches. And yet, for one protein to randomly come into existence would be, at best case, 10 to the 450th power. It's just impossible. And by the way, a protein's not even life. It's just one of the building blocks of life. So to get even one of the building blocks is impossible. Now, Walt Brown goes on to write another probabilistic analogy. He says, from another perspective, suppose we pack the entire universe with a simple form of life, such as bacteria. So whole universe is packed with it. And then next we break all the chemical bonds, we mix up all the atoms, and we let them form new links. If this were repeated 1 billion times a second for 20 billion years under the most favorable temperature and pressure conditions throughout the visible universe, would one bacterium of any type reemerge? He said the odds are much less than 1 chance in 10 to the 99,999,999,873rd power. That number is very hard to say. I'm not going to say it again. It's written up there. But pretty much your odds of drawing, if you could fill the whole universe with atoms, where they're everywhere, your odds of drawing one pre-selected one at random is 1 chance in 10 to the 112th. Okay? So even that's impossible, but 10 to the 112th is a lot easier than 10 and that ridiculous number up there, right? And in this calculation he made, he's saying, imagine you filled the whole universe, every square inch, with bacteria, living bacteria, and then broke it up into its little parts. What are the odds of it reassembling even into one? And it's that crazy number, right? So you already have all the building blocks there, but it still can't happen, right? So it's devastating. And almost as devastating is Fred Hoyle in his 1981 book, Evolution from Space. He claimed that there are roughly 2,000 enzymes, which you need for life, okay? And the chance of getting all 2,000 randomly is 1 in 10 to the 40,000th power. The entire universe could be one giant organic soup, and the odds of getting these enzymes are still 10 to the 40,000th power. This renders the evolutionary hypothesis impossible. And just to let you know, Fred Hoyle was an atheist, and he was an evolutionist that believed in spontaneous generation, and it was these staggering, and that GTE happened despite these odds. And so Hoyle wisely said that belief in spontaneous generation is actually psychological rather than scientific. He's like, no one believes this scientifically. It is a psychological reason they believe it. You know, and he points it out. He's like, the evolutionist will leave his umbrella at home if there's only a 10% chance of rain. But simultaneously, he places his faith in something that is mathematically as impossible as 1 in 10 to the 40,000th power. Right? It doesn't make any sense. Now, of course, you will have some evolutionists that try to escape this dilemma of these probability studies. The most notable is Richard Dawkins. He is the current generation's champion of atheistic evolution. He's notorious, he's witty, he's very insulting, and what he tries to do is he tries to turn the probability argument against us by agreeing. He's like, yes, oh yes.
You're ahead of yourself. Richard Dawkins.
Yeah, I did get ahead of myself. That was weird. Okay, let me see. There we are. Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, so Richard Dawkins agrees, right? He agrees that the universe and life existing is improbable. He's like, it's complex, and so, yeah, the probability is against it. But then he said, but if the universe was created, its creator would have to be more complicated than the universe. So if it's improbable that the universe would exist, it's even more improbable that the creator would exist. And therefore, by you invoking a creator, you're actually invoking something that needs a bigger explanation than the universe does. You're creating more questions than answers. Now, of course, some people will be like, oh yeah, well, what do I say about that? And I hear that, and I'm like, that's dumb. It really is. There's obvious problems with it. The first one is the fallacy of special pleading, and the fact that he's ignoring the presuppositional nature of his own argument. And let me explain. First, he is presupposing that since the universe exists, it must exist by chance. He's assuming that. He's assuming it's true by default. despite the fact that probability shows this is impossible. But he still assumes, well, the universe is here, so I don't care what the odds are, it had to have happened, right? That is an assumption on his part. He's ignoring the evidence. It's not like the evidence led him to his conclusion. No, he has a conclusion already that makes him ignore the evidence of the numbers. Without his presupposition that spontaneous generation is true, no one would assume that it did because the odds are so stacked against it. And then the second thing, the biggest problem of his argument is no one on our side is arguing that God came into existence by chance. That there was nothing and then by chance, God came into existence. So his argument is actually a categorical error. It's a fallacy of categorical error. He is wrongly applying the criteria of one category to an entirely different category that it doesn't apply to. And here's what I mean. God, by definition, is a necessary being. Remember back to that second lesson I gave? And a necessary being, by definition, is uncaused, unsustained, and not contingent on anything outside of himself. The universe is contingent. Therefore, odds can apply to things in the universe. God is not contingent, and therefore you cannot apply odds to a being like God. As a Christian, we would look at it and say, listen, the universe is contingent. Everything that's contingent has a cause. And therefore, if the universe itself had to have had a cause, there must be something necessary that caused it, not something that's contingent. Because if something contingent caused it, then that thing would have to have a cause. And if something caused that, then that thing would have a cause, and you cannot have an infinite regression. So if you have anything that's contingent, if something contingent exists, then something necessary has to exist, the necessary being. And a necessary being is an entirely different category, and these mathematical equations don't apply to it. Dawkins isn't making any sense, is my point, to say, well, the odds of God coming into existence would be even greater than the universe. That's silly. Right? Wrong category. Now, despite the numbers, evolutionists still insist on spontaneous generation. And one thing they will do, is it on this slide? Yes. One thing they will do is they will cite famous experiments for the evidence of the possibility of spontaneous generation. The most famous that are cited are the Miller-Urey experiments. And so let me describe what they did and then tell you the results. They filled a glass tube with certain gases, but they left oxygen out. So glass tube, you got gases in it. And then they used boiling water to drive the gas upward into a spark of 60,000 volts. The gas, after it got shocked by 60,000 volts, then passed through a cooled condenser into a trap. After passing this gas, that sounded bad, but after the gas passed through the condenser and after it was shocked, it took a week, but after a week of this, they produced a tiny amount of the simplest amino acids. Now, these amino acids could not produce life, but since life needs amino acids, evolutionists lionize this. They're like, we've proven that it can happen. I mean, they lionize these results. But listen, these results do more damage to the notion of spontaneous generation than advance it. And here's what I mean. First off, the experiment was not random. You're not going to have these things out in the random world that boiling water is going to push heat through 60,000 volts into a freezer trap. You don't have that in nature, so this isn't random. It was a controlled environment, radically different from anything outside of a lab. Furthermore, their chemical reactions only produced random, simple chemicals, which is the opposite of what life requires. Life requires very specific chemicals. Okay? And here's the thing, this produced amino acids, but life requires what are called left-handed amino acids. These experiments yielded both left-handed and right-handed, and whenever you have both, life is impossible. Life can only happen if there's left-handed. Now, what the evolutionist said is like, well, even though there's right or left, there's left ones there, so it's possible, and it's just, it's not. It's not. Okay, so this does not offer any evidence for chemical evolution. Let me reduce this claim to absurdity. Iron is a necessary building block for an automobile, right? I mean, your car's made out of metal, so iron is a necessary building block for your automobile. And in the right conditions, heat can transform combined minerals from the ground into iron. Therefore, because heat can turn minerals on the ground into iron, it must mean that your automobile could randomly be generated from the earth. Does that make sense? No, that's pretty absurd, right? But it's the same argument that these evolutionists are making. Oh, well, a couple amino acids could come up from it, and therefore life. Well, iron could randomly come up from the ground, therefore your car. No, it doesn't work. And before the evolutionists can object to this, remember the simplest possible self-reproducing cell has exponentially more information content than a car. In fact, remember that what I talked about last week, how if you could expand a cell to be like 20 kilometers long, it's more complicated than our most complex city. It's insane. A car is way less complicated than that. Okay, so the claim that these experiments provide evidence for spontaneous generation is more ludicrous than the hypothetical argument that a car could spontaneously originate from the ground. You see, what it comes down to is it's not a matter of chemicals, it's a matter of information. You could have all the parts of your car, all the elements of it, randomly appear in the same place. It's not going to become a car unless information makes all the parts fit with each other and work in tandem. It takes information to make a car. And it takes information to make a cell. I don't care how many amino acids or proteins you have. It's information, and information always comes from intelligent sources. And then the last thing I'll say about this is don't forget that all these simulations and experiments depended on intelligent interference by intelligent people. Okay, it wasn't random. So one wonders if the experimenters even are thinking about this. Are they catching the irony? How can you demonstrate life arising by time and chance within an intelligent experiment that's not random? But again, they repeat their lies and people don't think about it. Now, let me say a little bit about these primordial oozes or soups. There is no physical evidence that they ever existed. None, right? Now, supposedly what they say is you had to have had these soups. And they were filled with amino acids and nucleotides packed with nitrogen, because that's what we need for life. And you'd say, well, what's the evidence? They'd be like, well, we're here. There's life, therefore these oozes had to be there because we need these oozes. Just to let you know, they've never found any evidence for the oozes. It's an ad hoc explanation. Ad hoc is Latin, it just means just so. It's a just so explanation. Well, how did we get here? Well, there were clearly pools of a certain kind of ooze there's no evidence. And if these things existed, there would be evidence, right? Because evolutionists will point to some rocks and say, these are the oldest rocks on Earth. Well, if they are, and there were these primordial oozes all over the place, these rocks should be rich in nitrogen. There should be a certain amount of nitrogen in them, but nitrogen is nowhere to be found in them, especially in the samples that are the oldest rocks and the ones that they say are the oldest organic materials. In fact, the nitrogen levels, just to give you the stat, they're only 0.015%, which is nowhere near enough to warrant the belief in primordial soups. And listen, even if you did have these soups everywhere, remember the probability arguments I gave already. We gave them the most generous assumptions possible. We gave them soups better than the ones they claim were there, and it was still impossible. So even if the whole universe was a soup, you're not going to get life coming together randomly. So it's impossible even with the oozes, but it embarrasses their theory even more when you say, hey, oh, by the way, the history of these rocks makes it clear that these oozes were not actually there. Now, this lack of evidence has caused some of them to opt for a theory called panspermia. Since no evidence exists on Earth for spontaneous generation, some evolutionists appeal to life emerging somewhere else in the universe, and then it found its way here. Now, some advocates will say that a simple cell got here on a comet. It evolved elsewhere, and then who knows how, but maybe their planet blew up, like Krypton, and then this asteroids flying across space, and in the void of space with no oxygen or atmosphere, the cell survived and then landed on Earth, and then boom, you get the general theory of evolution. It's pretty crazy, right? But it doesn't solve their problem because you still have the same issue. If life can't spontaneously generate here, then why would you expect it to spontaneously generate there? We ran these probability tests for the whole universe, not just Earth. So it doesn't work. So then others will be like, yeah, that doesn't work. So what they do is they promote a theory called directed panspermia, where they claim that intelligent alien life seeded the Earth with cells that could then evolve into life as we know it. In fact, one of the discoverers of the DNA double helix, Francis Crick, he championed this view. He said, yeah, spontaneous generation's impossible on Earth, so aliens had to do it. But here's the thing. If, again, it only pushes the problem back, you're just kicking the can down the road. If life cannot spontaneously generate here, then why would it do so elsewhere? And if 14 billion years isn't anywhere near enough time for it to happen anywhere once, why are you going to assume it did? And then this civilization evolved into this masterful technological powerhouse, and then they seeded the Earth. It doesn't make any sense. And so here's the thing. No matter what kind of panspermia you invoke, spontaneous generation is impossible. And it is very astonishing how far scientists will go to avoid any conclusion that points to God. Aliens, it had to be aliens. Where'd they come from? We'll answer that later. No, answer it now. Where does this all come from? But they won't. They won't. Instead, they will appeal to blind faith, unfalsifiable ideas outside of the realm of science. These aren't science theories. You can't test them. These are just so stories. And they're not governed. So my point is, their science is not governed by unbiased experimentation like they claim. Their whole worldview, their whole evolutionary theory is ruled by philosophical and metaphysical commitments that is the gatekeeper of all their conclusions. They're not arriving there based on the science. So what this means is they're no different than Christians. Both sides perform science from presuppositions, and that's why we win the battle at the level of presuppositions. Remember, we looked at these insane improbabilities, and we calculated the assumptions for them that were unrealistically generous to the evolutionist. And I want you to understand that these calculations, they assume a uniform universe with random happenings across time. And I want you to understand that. As Christians, we don't believe that. We don't believe in a random universe that has a uniformity of nature. Yet, all these probability studies that we did are granting that assumption, okay? So, we don't believe that. What we believe is we believe that the universe is specially designed by the God of the Bible and that it is under his special providential control all the time. It's constantly under his control. As such, probability doesn't factor into our system because we would say life had a 100% certainty of existing rather than a mere probability because God willed it to be so. Right? We don't bring probability into this. So you might wonder, well, then why are you using arguments from probability? Because this is the argument from folly. Remember when I told you we use a two-step process? The argument from folly is where we answer them according to their folly. We step into their worldview. We grant them some of the things of their worldview, and then we show how it blows up. That's how we're using these probability studies. Okay? They possess excellent value because they demonstrate that spontaneous generation is impossible even in an atheistic universe that might possess the uniformity of nature. We say it's still impossible. And then when we add to the fact that the uniformity of nature can't even exist in a universe of randomness, we've just given an additional fatal blow to materialistic evolution. So, atheistic evolutionists, their presuppositions are impossible. But even if we grant them favorable assumptions, we still show them that probability works against them. Their position is futile. We are entering their worldview for argument's sake, and we're showing its absurdity. That is the argument from folly. Now, the point of this information is not to defeat the evolutionist with evidential reasoning. We're not evidentialists. At least I'm not. This is a class on presuppositionalism, but I'm showing you how presuppositionalists use evidence, right? I'm using evidence, but not in a way where if I give them enough evidence, then they'll come over to my worldview. No, I'm using evidence to show them that their system isn't scientific at all. That this is a philosophy like any other. That they are operating from a worldview like everyone else, and their worldview is based on unproven assumptions and presuppositions. That they are guilty of assuming what they're trying to prove. Namely, that 14 billion years of random chance can produce an orderly universe with complex life. They take this for granted. They expect you to take it for granted. They argue as if it's self-evidently true and put you in the position as if you have to somehow, the burden of proof's on you to prove that their assumptions are false. No, not at all. And they hold this assumption without ever submitting it to scientific or philosophical inquiry. Okay, but when we submit it to these inquiries, it hopelessly fails. So it is irrational to take a theory scientifically serious when its most fundamental assumption, that life could come from non-life, if that assumption is impossible, but their theory depends on that, how could you take their theory seriously? Right? You see how presuppositionalism works? It's not just saying, well, how do you account for that? How do you account for that? Yes, we say that, but then we do things like this that show them that we know our stuff. Okay, we're not just playing philosophical games with them. So, any questions before I move on? Because I'm done with spontaneous generation. Now I'm moving to the next thing. Anything? All right. The next big dog is uniformitarianism. Okay, this is one of their next doomed assumptions. Now, uniformitarianism, what is this? In the 18th and 19th centuries, this theory was used as the basis of rejecting belief in a young earth. It provided an explanation of geological conditions without a global flood. We could explain what we see on the earth without a flood. That's why they invented uniformitarianism. That's why they needed it. So what is it? Well, uniformitarianism is the belief that rates and conditions on earth do not change. So, for example, if scientists can measure current rates of, let's say, carbon-14 decay in our own time, then they could project into the past how long ago the process of decay began. In other words, the present is the key to understanding the past. Now, when they use these kinds of measurements, they yield extremely old dates for objects. Okay? That's why people will be like, well, haven't they tested the crust of the earth and shown it is billions of years old, right? That's what you've probably heard before. Okay? So I'm going to give you an answer to all that. See, these dating methods are believed to give evolution enough time to then occur. Like, for example, if the evolutionists, they already assume that if we have billions of years, we could have evolution. Therefore, this uniformitarianism gives us the billions of years. We've already proven it doesn't matter how many years they have. Spontaneous generation is not going to happen, okay? So don't forget that. We've already won. But why not? Why stop the assault? Let's break every bone that they bring into this fight. That way, when they walk away, they've got nothing left they could hold on to. Well, what about this? What about that? Okay? So the question is the uniformitarian assumption warranted? And the answer is no. Okay? Scientists lack the ability to know or prove the rate of decay in objects. They can't prove that it's the same now as it was a billion years ago or even 1,000 years ago. They can't. They have no ability to prove that. And the reason I say that is records of decay have only been kept for a little more than a century. And so from an empirical standpoint, a standpoint of observation, the most that anybody could say is that for 1 century, the rate of decay for some things has remained constant. Okay, you could say, yeah, for about 100 years of records, this rate of decay is constant. That's all we've observed. But to say that it was that way a billion years ago, too, that's a statement of faith. That's a statement you can never observe. So again, you want to call that out. It's an assumption. Scientists assume this. Okay, they assume that when we started keeping these records in the 1800s, it's always been that way long before the 1800s. What this means is if their assumption was wrong about these decay rates, then all their modern dating methods instantly become worthless. Okay, this assumption has to be true. If it's not true, then all their dating is worthless. So when the evolutionist cites all their dating methods, well, we could prove the age with argon, fission track, lead, and I'm not going to read them all up there, but there's a lot of these kinds of dating methods. These are called radiometric dating methods because they're measuring, radiometric rates of decay. And as I said, we only have records of this for a very limited time. So you cannot scientifically prove that what's been true for the last century has been true for 4.5 billion years. That is projection. Okay, and furthermore, they all agree that Earth is in a constant state of change. Right? If you ask them, what was the Earth like when dinosaurs were here? Well, all the plants are different. The atmosphere is different. You've seen the pictures. So if the Earth is constantly changing, then why wouldn't the rates of decay change? Again, they're being inconsistent. But the point is, there are greater problems for uniformitarianism than just the fact that they can't project further than 100 years. Uniformitarianism, at the end of the day, it is a philosophy, not a science. It's an ism. It's a belief. It's a philosophy that is applied to geology. And so with it, scientists attempt to reconstruct the geological history of Earth through what they call the geological record. You may have heard this. Well, the geological record shows. And what is the geological record? It's an arrangement of the rocks on Earth throughout time. But listen, I want you to have your thinking caps on. When they say geological record, don't confuse the word record there with historical records. These are not the same things. A historical record are records written by eyewitnesses describing what happened and what they saw. That's a historical record, okay? Items like rocks and fossils cannot be read like a book. You don't pick them up and say, no. It's not read like a history book would be. Instead, people with presuppositions and assumptions, they look at these things, they impose those assumptions on them, and then people today construct a history based on their interpretations that are beholden to their presuppositions. Do you understand what I'm saying? So again, if you read like Tacitus's History of Rome or Josephus's History of the Jews, that is way different than an evolutionist or geologist's history of the earth. Okay, Josephus was there when Jerusalem was being burned to the ground. Okay, none of the scientists were there when these rocks were formed. Not a single one of them. So they are making up a story based on their assumptions. Okay, and these assumptions flow out of their axioms that were imposed on the discipline of geology only about 150 years ago, a little more than that. And so let me show the bias of this. You're going to love this. NASA scientists believe that a massive global planet-wide flood accounts for the canyons on Mars, even though there's not a drop of water on Mars. But they deny that a global flood happened on Earth when we have enough water on Earth that could cover all the land by over 1.7 miles if all the land was evened out. We've got enough water here to cover the whole Earth. Mars doesn't have a drop, but they say impossible for a global flood here, but they look at Mars, there had to be one. I mean, come on. You get what I'm saying? This isn't science. This is presuppositions. These are assumptions. It's a philosophy hidden in a scientific vocabulary or veneer. Now, these deep time, because they say, well, you need this deep time to be a real science, to develop these sciences. Listen, these deep time biases are not necessary for geology or any field of science. One of the pioneers of geology was Nicholas Steno, 1683 to 1686, and it's his principles of stratigraphy that are still taught in geological courses today. He's the one who came up with the rules for how we do geology, and it's still used today. And guess what? He was a young earth creationist by today's standards, right? But that didn't prevent him from accurately describing the geological history of Tuscany, and then that became the model by which other geologists would describe certain regions. This didn't prevent him from being the one who discovered that fossils were fossils rather than rocks. Likewise, Isaac Newton, 1642 to 1727, or Johannes Kepler, 1571 to 1630, they also considered the Bible to be true and reliable. This didn't prevent Newton from discovering things like gravity or Kepler from discovering elliptical orbits. Paleontology, you think it's an evolutionary thing, because it is today, but the father, the pioneer of paleontology was John Woodward, 1665 to 1728, a creationist. Creationists that did not believe in deep time invented all these sciences and laid the groundwork and foundation upon which they still operate. So you don't need deep time for science. You just don't. These guys believed the Bible and they used it as a part of their interpretive framework. Just like the atheists are using their evolution as part of their interpretive framework. Okay? None of these pioneers of science believed that rocks demanded a history that extended backward billions of years. Instead, they all assumed one thing. There was a global catastrophic flood. And if you go in with that assumption, you could look at any part of the earth and you could explain what you see accurately. That's what they believed. And that is true. It is true, okay? But if you reject a rapid global catastrophe like a flood, then you have to make up a host of alternative explanations. Okay, so what we believe and what they believed is something called catastrophism. Okay, catastrophe, right? Catastrophism or catastrophism. That's probably how you pronounce it. Okay, catastrophism was held by the original scientist, but it was replaced by uniformitarianism. Not catastrophes, but just slow processes over time. It was the academics of the Enlightenment period, okay? The academics of the Enlightenment, so late 1700s, early 1800s, they're the ones who philosophically rejected the Bible as trustworthy and they exalted human reasoning. So a man named James Hutton, 1726 to 1797, he proposed the idea of long ages and uniform processes. And then it was popularized by a lawyer named Charles Lyell. And Lyell laid the groundwork for Darwin. He wasn't even a scientist. He was a lawyer. Lived from 1795 to 1797, to 1875. And in 1830 is when he popularized uniformitarianism. Now, he wasn't reporting on geology. He was interpreting it. He was giving it an interpretation that was opposite to what creationists were saying. His fundamental argument was that if you have enough time available, present geological phenomenon, meaning what you see in the present, could explain all geological features. Like you could get rid of the flood, you could get rid of a global catastrophe if you assume billions of years or millions of years for rivers and earthquakes and rain and icebergs and weather patterns to form all of our geological features. Now, he didn't arrive at this conclusion based on evidence. It was a philosophical commitment to reason from the start from the assumption that the Bible's not true and that there was no global flood. And so instead, this belief in billions of years was not from an observation. It was the result of assuming an ism, a philosophy, uniformitarianism. Now, a lot of geologists today don't like the term uniformitarianism. They prefer the term actualism. And so we should be fair and use the term that they want to use, but they're still uniformitarian, right? And so, you don't want to grant them a way out, but really it comes down to this, okay? They still believe that deep time and present processes account for all geological features. What makes them different from old school uniformitarians is that actualists actually accept that catastrophes occurred all over the earth, big catastrophes, and that's what accounts for most of the features. In other words, uniformitarianism by itself fails to explain a lot of what you see. Scientists started looking more and more and they said, you know what? No, regular processes cannot explain what we're seeing. Catastrophes explain this. Okay, so there has to be this big upheaval. And you find catastrophes in every single section of the globe, right? Every section of the earth. Now, we would look at it and say, okay, you see massive evidence of catastrophe everywhere, global flood, right? They would say, well, no, it just means over billions of years that was enough time for a major catastrophe to happen in every spot. You know what I'm saying? It still comes down to assumptions. So let that serve as a reminder. Presuppositions are what govern, right? They govern all conclusions. Charles Lyell, the father of uniformitarianism, or the popularizer of it, he wrote to a colleague, he said this. He said his goal was, quote, to free science from Moses, end quote. That's what he wanted to do. That was his plan. So modern geology did not emerge from those following the evidence wherever it may lead. Instead, it spawned with those who already had an anti-biblical agenda. Their agenda now serves as the gatekeeper of the sciences, which is sad, and this affects all of their conclusions. Now, some of them are going to object. The following objection is going to most assuredly come. They're going to say, well, haven't scientists proven that the earth is old through radiometric dating? And again, this comes back to uniformitarian principles, okay, or assumptions. Supposedly, radiometric dating has proven the age of the earth to be around 4.54 billion years. So the question for us is this a fact? Okay, well, first, we should understand the science behind radiometric dating, okay? And so the science behind it, I'll give the layman's explanation, is it goes like this, right? You have the atoms of unstable radioactive elements. And over the course of time, they transform into the atoms of stable, non-radioactive elements. So the original element that's radioactive and unstable is called the parent. And then it transforms into a stable, non-radioactive element, which is called the daughter. So you got the radioactive parent, the non-radioactive daughter. Okay? And with sometimes the element, the transformation is direct. So, for example, radioactive carbon will transform into non-radioactive nitrogen. It's direct. It goes from one to the other. There's other elements where it's not direct. The transformation will happen in stages. So, for example, radioactive uranium only becomes non-radioactive lead after 16 incremental transformations. Okay, whether you're talking direct or a bunch of increments, it doesn't matter. The amount of time for it to change from the radioactive to the non-radioactive, or from the parent to the daughter, is called a half-life. Okay, that's the term. It's called a half-life. Why is it called a half-life? This is the length of time it takes for one half of the atoms in the parent to change into an equal number of atoms in the daughter. So let's say you have an element that is 10 atoms. A half-life is how long it takes for 5 of those atoms to now become the daughter. So then you'd have 5 radioactive, 5 non-radioactive. And then the next half-life will take half of the radioactive ones that remain and turn those into the daughter. So after a second half-life, 3/4 will be the daughter, 1/4 will be the parent. And then this just keeps happening and happening. And based on that, the idea is that in theory, if you can measure the ratio of the daughter element to the parent element, then you'd be able to figure out how many half-lives happened. And if you could figure out how long the half-life is for this particular element, then you could just do the math and you could project it backward, and you end up with how long ago the process began. So that is how radiometric dating works. Okay? So it is the case that the ratio of daughter to parent, let me make sure, it's the case that the ratio of daughter to parent can be measured in rock samples. It can, okay? So they can do this. It's also the case that half-lives can be accurately measured in terms of time. So based on this information, scientists have determined the following half-lives. That from potassium to argon, one half-life will be 1.2 billion years. And from rubidium to strontium would be 48.8 billion years for a half-life. So that one can't even have a full half-life yet. But they're saying based on what they can measure, that's how long it would take. Samarium to neodymium would be 106 billion years. Uranium to lead would be 4.4 billion years, etc. Okay? So this sounds reasonable and straightforward, except for a major problem. When these radiometric dates are tested and performed on rocks that we already know the age, it yields an age way older than the rocks actually are. For example, Mount Nauruhoe, it's hard to say, but it's Nauruhoe, produced 3 lava flows in 1949, 1954, and 1975 and formed some rocks. 2003, 8 samples were tested using the potassium-argon testing method, and the results of these 8 samples ranged between 270,000 years to 3.5 million years, yet we know these rocks came into existence in 1954. So, you run this test on a rock that we know its age, and you're saying it's 3 million years old when it's like 70 years old. That tells you something is wrong here. Same thing happened with Mount St. Helens eruption in 1986. Okay, they tested both whole rocks and individual minerals, and the results were between 350,000 years to 2.8 million years, yet the rocks were only 40 years old when they tested them. So we have the known age, but they're coming back with ages that are ridiculous. Okay, now that should be enough to make the scientists say, all right, our whole system is garbage. We should reevaluate this. But no, people have the bad habit of doubling down. So why the discrepancy? Well, it comes down to assumptions. Like usual, right? It always comes down to assumptions. First, what you got to understand is geologists assume, okay, I'm going to give you 3 assumptions. They assume that the daughter element always begins at 0 with these rocks. So when the rock formed, there was only the parent, there was no daughter there. That's the first assumption. The second assumption is they assume that the rock became a closed system right after it was formed. A closed system means that nothing from the outside can affect it. So there's no parent element or daughter element that's been deposited or removed. It's a closed system. Nothing could interfere with it. It's going to now operate according to these processes. And then the third assumption is that the half-life has remained constant at today's rate. So whatever the rate is today, that's what the rate had to be back then. So of course that is classic uniformitarianism. Now, without an eyewitness who could measure the half-lives back then, it will never be more than an assumption. Okay? It's not a fact. And in fact, it's not just an assumption, okay? Or in fact, it's a wrong assumption is what I mean, because I've already mentioned and showed you that the rocks with known ages are testing way older, according to this, than they really are. And that tells you something. That means at least one of these 3 assumptions is wrong. If you take a rock that we know is 40 years old, but your test is showing it's 3 million years old, one of these 3 assumptions is wrong, or all of them are wrong. Now, I'm going to argue that all of them are wrong, but give me a little bit of time to get there. Let's first start with this first assumption. That what would happen, because remember, the first assumption is there's 0 daughter element when the rock initially forms. Okay, so what would happen, right? What would happen if there was some daughter element that was there at the beginning? Okay, they're assuming there wasn't. But what if like 50% of it was already daughter when it was formed? As soon as they start conducting these radiometric tests and they're assuming the half-lives that they have now, and they assume it all the way back to 0 daughter element, they're going to end up with a rock or a date that's way older than the rock actually is. That had to have happened with these rocks they tested. There had to have been daughter elements already in there when the rocks formed. So that means their first assumption was wrong. That is why, their dates are so off. And so what they did is they came up with a new system called isochron dating as an alternative to radiometric dating. It's a lot more complex. It controls for a lot more variables. When you read it, I had to read it a couple times to understand it. It sounded very precise, and it's supposed to be able to work without the first assumption. We don't need to know how much daughter or parent was there at the beginning. This is so precise, we will be able to figure out how old these rocks are. And the crazy thing is, even though on paper it's better than radiometric dating in every way, when they did the isochronic tests on the rocks we know their age, they came back even older. It was worse than the radiometric testing. So for example, when the Mount Nauruhoe rocks were tested with this new system, they came back between 133 million and 3 billion years old. Way worse than it was under the radiometric one. Okay, so what else would account for a rock less than 70 years old testing as hundreds of millions, if not billions of years old? It means not just the first assumption was wrong, Okay, because this new test, the isochronic test, mitigates for the first assumption. It means the other two assumptions have to be wrong as well, is my point. And that's why these dates are coming back so messed up. Now, you might be wondering, well, what do the scientists say when this happens? You know, what do they say? Well, they issue an ad hoc fallacy, right? They just give a just so explanation devoid of evidence. What they'll say is, well, these rocks clearly got contaminated with evidence. Oh, so it wasn't a closed system. Well, in this case, it wasn't, but all the other ones that we believe, those ones were closed. It's like, come on, that is just baloney. And in fact, I strongly recommend, if you ever get the time, this book is called Evolutionists Say the Oddest Things. All this is quotes from famous evolutionists. And specifically on pages 93 and 94 of this book, it contains quotations of leading scientists admitting the arbitrary nature of their community's accepting and rejecting of the results of radiometric tests. In other words, they admit, listen, when we reject a test, it's because we don't like the result. But when we like the result, we tout it as proof. They're admitting that. Does this sound like science to you? No, this is presuppositions, this is philosophy, this is not science. So I suppose we should ask, why do these tests ultimately fail? Jim Mason offers a helpful analogy. Okay, so imagine a graduated cylinder, so a cylinder that's going to hold water. Okay, like the ones that were used in high school chemistry classes. And say, for instance, that cylinder contains 300 milliliters of water. And let's say it sits under a faucet that's dripping 50 milliliters per hour. Using uniformitarian assumptions, if it's got 300 in it, but you know it's dripping 50 per hour, you would assume that it has been dripping, or it's been there for 6 hours, right? Because you're just taking 300 and you're dividing it by 50. Now, that answer assumes three things, the same three assumptions. It first assumes that the cylinder began with no liquid present, right? Second, it assumes that nothing was added or removed from the cylinder at any point in the process. And then third, it assumes the input rate of the faucet, meaning the rate of the faucet dripping didn't change at all. It wasn't slower at any point, wasn't faster at any point, it was constant. But here's the thing. Those are assumptions that you don't know. What if it started out with 200 milliliters of water already in it, and then you put it under the faucet that drips 50 milliliters per hour? Then it would only be 2 hours. But with your uniformitarian assumptions, you'd be like, no, this has been going at it for 6 hours. But in reality, it's only been going at it for 2 hours because it didn't start at zero. Is my point. You can't assume it started at zero. And what if at some point a scientist walks in, takes it out, dumps some of the water out, or adds more water to it? You don't know that, right? But they're assuming that never happened, that so it's a closed system, nothing outside added or took away from it. But you can't assume that, right? And then what if it started off at 100 milliliters per hour, but due to pipe issues, it started slowing? Okay, so again, all those things would throw off the calculation and you would not get 6 hours. It would be some different time. Okay, that's exactly what's happening. These guys are assuming zero daughter, zero outside interference, and that the rate is always the same. But every time we date known aged rocks, it comes back wonky. It doesn't fit with their system. So uniformitarianism, hopefully that little water analogy explains to you why it is such a flawed idea, why you can't trust this radiometric dating. When it comes to both radiometric and isochron dating, geologists, they begin with these assumptions. Okay, it's well known, by the way, in geological processes that something is called hydrothermal leaching and mineral diffusion. When those happen, the system's not closed. Things are getting in and getting out of the system. That happens. That's observed to happening. So the second assumption isn't even true. And they know it's true. And that is always going to throw off the dating of these things. Okay, it can alter the parent-daughter ratios like that. Furthermore, these guys assume the half-lives have remained constant and that today's values reflect the values of the past. But recent discoveries indicate the transformation rates of these particular things, I don't even know how to say these, but the CO to the Ni and all that, these are specific things that recent experiments have shown that the rate of decay changes based on solar activity. The more these things are in the sun, the faster or slower they decay. So that means that the assumption that the rate of decay stays the same is not true. We've got a bunch of elements that have been tested and proven that it changes based on the conditions they're in. So again, if you don't know those conditions, you can never know if these rates have always been the same. Okay, so there's evidence that the systems are not closed due to the mineral diffusion and hydrothermal leaking. It's also clear that outside factors like sunlight could speed up or slow down transformation. And recent laboratory tests demonstrated that beta decay could be sped up 1 billion times if you just remove a couple electrons. So if electrons escape, the clock shoots up really, really fast. And so my point is, anybody that honestly evaluates the science of radiometric dating should see that it is very, very unreliable. Now, related to this is carbon dating. I'm sure you've all heard of carbon dating, right? People always try to date stuff with carbon. It uses the same process, but it's not the same thing. And the reason it's not the same thing is because carbon dates things that were once alive. It's organic material that's no longer living. In other words, it tests the carbon that came from sources that were alive but dead. And so what it's testing is carbon-14. Carbon-14 is a radioactive form of carbon that exists in all living things. And when the organism is alive, the carbon-14 remains in equilibrium. It doesn't grow, doesn't decrease. It is what it is. But as soon as you die, okay, then the carbon-14 starts to transform into nitrogen. And then what will happen is the carbon-14 ends up being the parent element, nitrogen ends up being the daughter element. But since nitrogen is a gas, it escapes into the atmosphere. So you're not actually going to find the nitrogen in the thing that you're dating. But you're going to notice that the carbon-14 has diminished a lot, and based on mathematical calculations, you'd be able to figure out how much of it became nitrogen and then escaped. Okay? So that's the basic idea besides this. So how does the carbon dating then work? Well, there's a different type of carbon that's in living organisms that does not transform into the daughter element, and that is called normal carbon, or carbon-12. That remains constant even after something dies, whether it's a plant or an animal. So by comparing the normal carbon ratio of carbon-12 to that of carbon-14, you could theoretically date the object based on how much carbon-14 it has in relation to the carbon that doesn't change, which is carbon-12. Now, this relies on two assumptions. First, you have to assume that the ratio of carbon in the atmosphere today is identical to what it was when the creature died. Okay, so if the atmosphere's carbon levels were different back then than today, this won't work. But they assume it's been the same, that it has to be the same, which is weird because, again, they assume very different conditions in different geological ages, but oh well. And then the second thing they assume is that no change has happened to the half-life. Okay, so half-life's constant, and the ratio of C4 to C14 in the atmosphere has always been what it is now. Now, carbon-14 is not easy to detect. The ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 in the atmosphere today is 1 atom of carbon-14 for every 1.2 trillion atoms of carbon-12. Right? So carbon-14 is very, very minimal. But there's machines that can detect it in very small amounts. But even these machines can't detect it after 15 half-lives, or 15.6 half-lives, if I'm going to be exact, right? And so, since carbon-14 has a short half-life, it's 5,730 years. That is the half-life of carbon-14, okay? It can only date things to 90,000 years old. And that's assuming these assumptions, right? I'm going to tell you right now these assumptions are wrong. But assuming evolutionary assumptions are true, carbon dating can only date things to 90,000 years. So if somebody says carbon dating proves, the Earth is billions of years old, you could say you're ignorant. Radiometric dating is what you're talking about. Carbon dating only can go back 90,000 years. Let me educate you, or whatever. Okay, but the thing is, just want to throw that out there because the average unbeliever out there mixes things up. They don't know what carbon dating even is. Okay, but even with this 90,000 years, that is a lot more than the 6,000 years we say the Earth is based on our biblical assumptions as creationists. And it's also worth noting that carbon dating, though, it doesn't just make a headache for us. And it doesn't really make a headache for us, but it's not just for us that it's a problem. It is a bigger problem for the evolutionists that rely on their geological dating techniques or their radiometric ones. And why do I say that? Well, coal, you guys know what coal is. You're bad for Christmas. Santa gives you a coal. Anyhow, so coal is mostly carbon. And it's found in nearly all strata of the geological column. Okay, so meaning you'll find it very deep in the ground and very high on the ground. In 2003, 10 coal samples collected from different strata across the U.S. were all tested for carbon-14. And if the coal samples were dated according to the supposed age of the rocks they were found in, so they dated the rocks with the radiometric ones that we were talking about, okay, the coal should have been 37 million years to 300 million years old. That was the range. But that's past the 90,000 year limit for carbon. If you could detect carbon, it can't be older than 90,000 years. And yet it's embedded in rocks that are 300 million years. You notice how their clocks aren't even matching up? Their clocks disagree with each other. That's a problem, okay? So anyhow, and the carbon-14 that was detected in them only went back in their system to 59,000 years. So this is one more example where their clocks contradict each other, and what they will do is appeal to a fallacy, an ad hoc one, again, a just so explanation, and they'll say, well, contamination must have happened. No, you just don't like the results. Goes back to reading those quotes from this that I told you about. Now, when you look at these laboratories that do the testing, they safeguard against contamination. So contamination didn't happen. Not only that, diamonds. Okay, diamonds, if you've seen the old Superman movies, he squeezed that coal and it turned into a diamond. At that moment, I wished I was Superman. You could get so rich. But anyhow, so diamonds are going to have carbon in them, and they are the hardest mineral on Earth that naturally occurs. And so diamonds are protected from infiltration. Contamination's impossible. But tests on 7 diamond samples averaged a date of 50,000 years. Yet according to uniformitarian geology, they have to be 3 billion years old based on where they're found and the process it takes to make them. And yet the carbon shows they can only be 50,000 years. And so here's my point. What is a bigger gap to cover? We have to get the 50,000 years down to 6,000. They have to get the 3 billion down to 50,000. You see how it's a bigger problem for them? They have to jump over the Pacific Ocean. We just have to jump over a puddle in comparison based on these numbers. So carbon dating is actually a much bigger problem for them. Now, we are not troubled by these dates of 50,000 years because remember those 2 assumptions, okay, that the ratio of carbon-14 and carbon-12 in the atmosphere is the same today as it has been for at the time of the organism's death. Okay, that without that assumption, the whole thing gets messed up. And then the assumption that there's been no change in the half-life of carbon-14. We're not beholden to those assumptions, okay? We assume there was a flood, right? Okay, we all agree. As Christians, we believe there was a flood. If there was a flood, and you start saying, okay, what would that mean? That starts changing some of these conditions. And here's what I mean. If a global flood occurred, it would have buried a whole bunch of biosphere C12. Meaning there would have been more C12 back then, but it got buried by the flood waters and the rains pushing it down. That would mean before the flood happened, there was more C12, carbon-12 in the atmosphere than today. Additionally, there's no reason to believe that the radioactive carbon was as abundant back then because it was closer to the beginning of creation. You only had about 1,000 years of the curse instead of 6,000 years of the curse, right? And so radioactive, that's a matter of decay. right? There would have been less decadence because less time. So there wouldn't have been as much radioactive carbon in existence. There would have been more normal carbon, but it would have got pushed down by the flood. But before the flood, my point is more C12 than today, less C14 than today, okay? So you got to understand that. And so you also have to understand that the Earth's magnetic field would have been stronger back then, and scientists agree on that. Measurements over the last 100 years have demonstrated that the Earth's magnetic field is decreasing, which means back then it would have been stronger. Why am I bringing up the magnetic field? It has been proven in tests that magnetic fields reduce the influx of cosmic rays. Cosmic rays are what lead to radioactivity. Okay, so if you have less cosmic rays coming in from outside of our atmosphere, you're going to have less things going radioactive. A stronger magnetic field back in the pre-flood days would have also meant less C14. Okay, so remember, radiocarbon or carbon dating depends on the C14 and C12 ratio being the same today as it was back then, but it wouldn't be. If the flood is true, it would be different, very different, okay? So, because the biblical model assumes higher levels of C12 prior to the flood, which means more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that would also mean there would be more vegetation on the earth before the flood, which would account for all the coal we have, right? There would be so much plant life. And so that's where all the coal comes from. On their model, they just need billions of years and they still can't explain it, right? But with all that lush vegetation and a fast burial through a flood, man, we can explain the coal. Furthermore, the biblical model also describes massive volcanic activity, because where did the flood water come from? You have 40 days of rain, but what else? You have the fountains of the deep bursting. That's volcanic activity, okay? So you have these volcanoes releasing a bunch of carbon, okay, a bunch of carbon-14 into the atmosphere, right? So it shifts everything. And then after the flood was over, what you're going to have is the carbon-12 and carbon-14 levels would have then increased to today's ratios, and creationists could explain exactly how in a model that makes sense. Okay? Now, since the gap between C12 and C14 was wider before the flood than its present ratio, anything that died before the flood or during the flood would yield carbon dating ages that appear much older, if you're going to make the calculation off today's present assumptions, okay? In other words, when they date something today, it's only based on how old it looks based on half-lives on today's calculation, okay? But if that creature died when there's different C12 and different C14 ratio, whatever date they're getting now isn't the right date. It's untrustworthy. And by the way, they've done carbon dating on like a living seal. It was a seal, like, little ocean seals. And it came back, it's 12,000 years old, and it was right there, just sealing around. So again, this stuff, when we date things that we know the age of, it doesn't always come back accurate. Okay, so the ratio of the pre-flood world is different. Standard assumptions of radiocarbon dating are not going to accurately date anything that died before the flood. And so the carbon dating clock will not work on anything that's older than 4,500 years old. It can be accurate on things from 4,500 years ago to now, but beyond that, no. And that should not surprise anyone at this point, because we've seen how rocks with known ages are being dated as way older than they really are. And we cannot underestimate the importance of this point. Okay, the deep time ages all depend on uniformitarian assumptions. But when you get rid of those assumptions, the dates now start to match a biblical timeline every single time. Okay, these dates come from their assumptions. You get rid of the assumptions, we now get biblical timelines for literally everything. These are not alternative facts appealed to by creationists. We're all looking at the same facts, okay? The difference is the interpretation of the facts. And so these alternative interpretations, they are coming based on these alternative assumptions. And these alternative assumptions come from alternative presuppositions. We end up round circle back at where we always start. And so I've demonstrated that the evolutionary conclusions are based on faulty assumptions that are easily falsifiable. Let me see how much more I got. Okay, I'll be real fast through the rest of this. Let me also bring up the uniformitarian inconsistency. These guys are so inconsistent of their uniformitarian principles. And what I mean by that is that there are a lot of items that point to a young earth if you use uniformitarianism. Okay, but when it comes to these clocks, the evolutionists ignore them. So let me just give you a couple examples. Let's go back to that magnetic field. We know the rate of its decay right now. If we calculate backward, it means the magnetic field can't be more than 10,000 years old. If the present rate of decay is the same as it always has been, it can't be more than 10,000 years old. Why don't they ever say that? If the present is the key to the past, then how can the Earth be more than 10,000 years if the magnetic field could be no older? What about red blood cells, hemoglobin, and collagen? They've been found in non-fossilized dinosaur tissue. I'll be talking about that probably next time or the time after that. But based on the current rates of decay, creatures from which the samples came could not be older than a few thousand years, and yet they're saying it was 65 million years old. But on present rates of decay, could only be a couple thousand years old. Or perhaps we should consider helium and zircons that's in granite. At the current rate in which helium diffuses out of zircon, these are measurable rates. At today's rate, all helium should have disappeared in 100,000 years. But there's still helium in them. Strangely, 58% of the helium is still present in the zircon when there should be none. How about the moon? Okay, the moon presents a problem because we know, we can measure, every year it moves 1.5 inches away from the Earth. Okay, every year it's 1.5 inches further. At that rate, if you count backwards, 1.3 billion years ago, the moon would have been connected to the Earth. Okay, but 1.3 billion years ago, this Earth needed the moon for tides and all that type of stuff. So again, doesn't work. Okay, and they come up with dumb explanations. Well, maybe we captured the moon in orbit. No, because then it would be an elongated orbit instead of a circular one. But anyhow, and if that did happen, the geological catastrophes across the globe would have changed rates and conditions, which would have made this all worthless anyway. The general theory of evolution needs life evolving for 4.5 billion years. And that's impossible based on these moon recession rates. So, another one, salt. Salt, what do evolutionists do with salt entering the ocean? It is entering the ocean at a faster rate than we see it escaping it. At the current rate, the sea would be far saltier than it is right now if this had been going on for billions of years. Instead, it reflects a saltiness of only 62 million years, not 4.5 billion. And this is at their current rates. Okay, now we don't believe this has been going on 62 million years. The flood could account for why it is the way it is right now. Okay, so anyhow, consider my point with this. Uniformitarian principles give us dates for the Earth on these clocks that are much younger than the evolutionists will allow. So what do they do with them? They ignore them. Well, this one doesn't fit our conclusion, so we can't keep this. Does that sound like science to you? No. And this is a pretty big number of things that if you use their same principles, undermine their position. So it is fair for the Christian to ask them if they really believe rates and conditions don't change. Because if the Earth could be dated on that basis, then why do they ignore these natural clocks that destroy their belief in a 4.5 billion year old Earth? Why do they selectively accept the clocks that line up with their a priori belief in billions of years? The answer is simple. These clocks, don't line up with their presuppositions, so they reject them. Evolutionists can hardly claim that they form their conclusions based on an unbiased following of the evidence. They did not. All these counterexamples demonstrate that the evolutionists fail the PIA technique in terms of inconsistency and arbitrariness, because they are woefully inconsistent and they're horribly arbitrary. They arbitrarily accept some clocks and reject others, all based on does it fit in their theory or not. That's it. That's inconsistent. It's an inconsistent application of their own uniformitarian rules and presuppositions. So I hope the Christian hearing this, I know it's technical, okay, but if you put the time into it, you could retain a lot of this. And even if you just retain the basics, I hope you could see that we have nothing to fear from the general theory of evolution. It is a woefully inadequate account of the universe. So let me conclude. Our goal is to demonstrate that evolution does not have an abundance of great evidence that embarrasses us, but on the contrary, there is a ton of counter evidence that discredits their theory. Despite this, they ignore the counter evidence because their philosophical commitments won't allow this evidence. That's all this is. And that fact alone demonstrates why evidential apologetics is deficient. Okay, I've given a bunch of evidence. This evidence, it's been presented to them. They haven't all just dropped their atheism and become creationists. Why? Because at the end of the day, it's not about evidence. If you give them evidence that doesn't fit their network of beliefs, they dismiss your evidence, even if it's real. And they only hold to the evidence that supports what they already believe. That is why we have to go at it from a presuppositional standpoint. The atheist has never lacked evidence for creation. He is suppressing it, or she is suppressing it. And so for this reason, we begin at the presuppositional level with the tag, the transcendental argument, as I did last week, and then we bring up this evidence to demonstrate to them their inconsistency and their arbitrariness, okay? We cannot allow the evolutionist to believe he can sit in judgment over the claims of God. Instead, we're challenging him with the absolute fact that God, the God of the Bible, exists. We press the atheist conscience with evangelism, with God's moral law, with the Ten Commandments, to drive them to that point of repentance. Okay? We know this person's actively suppressing the truth and unrighteousness. So the goal of TAG is to demonstrate the total groundlessness of atheism and materialism and naturalism and evolution. And then we provide evidence as a demonstration of the unbeliever's arbitrariness and inconsistency. And listen, one reason I'm spending as much time as I am on evolution is through this particular topic, I'm giving you a much more detailed argument from Folly. And then in the second part, which will also be probably 3 or 4 lessons, I'm then going to give you the argument of truth to show you what it looks like. What does it look like to walk into their world with their assumptions and destroy it? That's what we're doing right now. But then we also have to be able to show, look, let's assume our assumptions, and now let me show you what the evidence points to, right? And so I think that the best part of this course is the evolution. Even though in all of the lessons, whether it's atheism or dualism or Hinduism, I'm doing this, but I'm doing it in maybe 2 hours for each of them. With evolution, I'm giving you a comprehensive view of what this looks like. That way you would actually be equipped to even take on a university biology professor. You will have that much information on this. Not just the stooge at the park who, watches Marvel and, Spider-Man believes in evolution, so he does too. No, I'm also talking about, you go to Cal State San Bernardino or UCR and you would actually be able to go toe-to-toe and, make a biology professor look foolish. But anyhow, so up to this point, we have seen that with probability, radiometric dating, and carbon dating, evolution's got nothing to stand on, and we're just getting started. More is yet to come. So with that, I will take